neglected to say that next Sunday is World Communion Sunday. We'll be celebrating the sacrament with approximately probably hundreds and hundreds of millions across the world at the same time. Not at the same time, but the same day. So we encourage you to come to that. In addition to being World Communion Sunday, at our church we have a Mission Sunday too. Various mission representatives will be here to show what they're doing in the community, some of the ones that Steve mentioned earlier, and they will have tables set up downstairs in Fisher Hall. You know, since we are in the middle of the football season, I thought I'd share with you the decals I saw on the back of a car recently while waiting at a stoplight. On one side of the back of the car was the Cleveland Browns logo, and then the license plate, the person's license plate was bordered by a Pittsburgh Steelers frame. Interesting because the two teams are bitter rivals. On the other side of the car's tailgate was an Ohio State decal. And then finally on the other side of the tailgate was a Kansas State one. The driver had all the bases covered. You can talk about hedging your bets. As I have said the last several Sundays, that in my last few Sundays as your pastor, I'd like to share key components of Scripture that, if internalized and taken to heart, could transform the way you view yourself and the way you view others and the way you view the world. The Beatitudes, read for us by Margot this morning, are the bullet points of the Christian Playbook, I like to call them. They were the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount and were delivered by Jesus probably sometime around 30 AD. I would venture to say that if one memorized the Beatitudes, it would turn out to be a memorization that would guide and instruct your life every day, serving as a compass in just about everything you did. The principles of the Beatitudes, if practiced widely, would bring God's kingdom closer to reality here on earth, and God's kingdom is what we always strive to usher in, not only into our own hearts, but into the condition of the world. Consider for a moment what the world would be like if everybody was a peacemaker, if everybody saw themselves as the light of the world, if everybody got over their anger with other people, if everybody didn't feel the need for retaliation, if everybody prayed for their enemies, if everybody offered prayers for less fighting and more conciliation, if everybody did unto others as they would have done unto themselves. Imagine for a minute what the world would be like. One of former President Dwight Eisenhower's quotes at the Eisenhower Museum in Abilene seems to combine perfectly two of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Former President Eisenhower's quote read, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." I thought, how perfect a statement relative to Jesus' intent in the Beatitudes. He teaches us in the Beatitudes that true peace, both in a personal and corporate sense, comes from the saving power of Christian principles. And the saving power of Christian principles create characteristics that in the end help create ways in which you and I become better people. And without better people, we can't be a better world. But with better people, we can become a better world. The Beatitudes teach this concept in a very simple and practical way. Now, the football playbook that players study and execute give them a fundamental understanding of the culture and the mission of the team. The person who studies and executes the Beatitudes receives a fundamental understanding of the purpose of life, and therefore will significantly increase one's confidence in how he or she conducts his or her life. I was listening to a college sports radio station last week, imagine that, and one of the commentators, Danny Cannell, a former Florida State quarterback, an NFL quarterback, said that his 12-year-old daughter was running for president of her student council, and she had to give her campaign speech to convince her fellow classmates to vote for her. Her father was urging his daughter to memorize her speech and to go over and over it multiple times before she delivered it. And if she did that, it would greatly increase her confidence. But she had to first put the painstaking preparation in. So it is in the Christian life. If you study the scriptures, such as the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, and rehearse them over and over in your mind, live them out in your daily life, you will develop the confidence needed to make important decisions in your life. You will be more God-driven than you will be man-driven. Now, beatitude is from the Latin beatus, meaning blessed. Quite simply, your life, my life, will be more blessed and more rewarding if you practice the Beatitudes. It would be hard to argue that the more people practice Beatitudes, the more the world will have a chance for peace. Now, Jesus was serious about this because before he delivered the Sermon on the Mount, which included the Beatitudes, he assumed the normal position of a Jewish teacher, which was sitting down. He was teaching people how to live. And when a teacher or rabbi taught in those days, people listened. As an aside, when Jennifer and I were in Jerusalem last May, while doing some shopping, I was negotiating some prices with the Jewish store owner. He asked me, I shared this when I presented my slides, he asked me what I did for a living, to which I replied, I was a minister. Then he said, sure you're not a rabbi? Now, there isn't enough time to go into detail about each of the 9 Beatitudes, but it's widely believed that Jesus taught these 9 Beatitudes to shake things up a little bit. The Jews at that time, and Jesus, of course, was Jewish, were living in Roman-occupied Palestine, victims of often ruthless treatment by their captors. The tendency for some was to fight back, to seek revenge, to hate and disdain their enemies. Jesus lived in an area called Galilee, an important center for a group called the Zealots, a militant Jewish group fighting for freedom for their homeland. And so to hear things like, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, was like putting a square peg into a round hole. It just didn't fit. It didn't make any sense to an occupied people. In many minds, the things Jesus was saying, cannot be reconciled to what was actually going on in the world. How could one, for instance, be merciful to those who showed no mercy? Or how could one be a peacemaker if one lived under the grip of tyranny? But Jesus was saying through these Beatitudes, one could discover an inner contentment unaltered and unaffected by anything in the outside world. In other words, your physical circumstances change, and you have little control over outside forces, but you do have control over what's inside, and you do have the capacity to transform yourself. As Paul said, you've heard it before many times, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Jesus is saying the same thing to the rich and powerful Nicodemus. One of the lessons read this morning by Margot. Jesus is basically saying to Nicodemus, nothing is going to change unless you change yourself. Nothing is going to matter unless you have your own personal reformation. And with this same renewal, if enough people experienced it, could come a renewal of the world. So if you look at yourself as being poor in spirit, for instance, the first beatitude, that is humble in the presence of others, and most importantly, humble in the presence of God, realizing that there's so much still to learn, there's so many better attitudes to have about life, and there are greater distances to travel to become a better person. All of this will produce an inner contentment and peace, a type that nothing else on the outside world has to offer. So Jesus is telling us to be poor in spirit. He's saying, never consider yourself to be more important than the other guy. Always compare yourself to Jesus, and you will understand how much further you have to go, as I was saying last week. And the less self-centered and self-serving people become, the less self-centered and self-serving the world will become. Jesus teaches us about those who mourn, and those who are gentle, and those who are pure in heart. Mourning in this case is not so much about mourning for ourselves, but mourning for others. Mourning the fact that the world is in such a state of flux, and mourning for the victims of this state of flux. Many places in the world become victims, that we know, of natural disasters. Jesus is telling us to not be indifferent to those people we don't even know, but to mourn for them. And hopefully this mourning will motivate you and me to do something to help. We mourn, for instance, for the victims of the recent Hurricane Dorian. Thousands of lives thrown into chaos and enormous loss by a natural disaster. If we didn't mourn, the mission committee, for instance, of our congregation wouldn't have authorized a $2,500 payment to the First Presbyterian Church of New Bern, North Carolina, which has a disaster relief fund for hurricane victims. If we didn't mourn for our children who don't have adequate clothing for a cold winter, you probably wouldn't see the mittens and boots and scarves and coats and a narthex every Thanksgiving season under the direction of our deacons. If we didn't mourn for the children in our own Manhattan community who didn't have adequate school supplies when school began, we wouldn't see piles of backpacks in front of the communion table every August, another effort led by our deacons. It's good to mourn if this mourning motivates us to do something about it. Mourning helps raise the antennas of affection and attention to our role in making the world a better place to live, and our role in making life less difficult for others. So be as sad as you can about someone else's suffering, but take that same sadness and do something about it. Jesus in the Beatitudes talks about mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Again, we are not drawn to merciless people. We want to see mercy in others, and others want to see mercy in us. Mercy is manifested in many ways, we know. Forgiveness, help for the needy, patience with those who do not understand, tolerance of those who make mistakes. We follow the lead of Jesus in the mercy that he exhibited on the cross. Jesus also wants us to search for what is right in life. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what is right, for they shall be satisfied. He doesn't want us to go the way that is most expedient for us, or the way that is only beneficial to us, or the way that continually compromises instead of taking a stand for what is right. He wants us to stick our necks out when we need to stick our necks out. In many ways, this beatitude ties into the final one. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When we hunger and thirst for what is right, we may feel a little persecuted. We may feel some pain. We may feel a little isolation, but nowhere near the contentment and peace from standing up for what we know to be right. When the disciples stood up for the Christian faith in face of daunting odds, when Martin Luther didn't back down from his profession of faith before the church's hierarchy, when reformer John Knox was sentenced to the galleys for not saying what the officials wanted him to say, when the Chinese dissident stood in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and in literature, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, when the Macomb, Alabama attorney Atticus Finch took the case of defending an African-American man falsely accused of assaulting a white woman, the town turned on the deeply respected man and his family. But the comments of Miss Maudie, a woman who took the opposite view of the town folk, live to this day in the annals of American literature. She said to Atticus Finch's children, "I simply want to tell you that there are some men who are born to do unpleasant jobs for us. Your father is one of them. we're so rarely called upon to be good Christians. But when we are, we got men like Atticus. Every generation, we live in a world that is in need of the spirit of the Beatitudes. And it begins with you and me and our willingness to learn them and to practice them. If they become your life's playbook, great and wonderful things are going to happen. And when we need to get that playbook in as many people's hands as possible, and then we will not see change only personally, but we will see it globally. And the Beatitudes are a good way to start. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for what is right, they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But when you think about it, it all comes down to that one word: love. Being merciful, being peacemakers, mourning for others. When you do all these things, you are simply loving others. And that's what the whole Christian faith is grounded on, is love. You and I, we want to be loved. Everyone wants to be loved. Paul said, the greatest of these is love. In closing, Colin Powell, retired four-star Army general and former Secretary of State, writes in his autobiography that he grew up in the South Bronx and said that one of his earliest memories was one of trauma. At the age of 4, he was playing on the floor and he stuck a hairpin into an electrical outlet, resulting in a blinding flash, almost lifting him off the floor. He said he still remembered his grandmother scolding and hugging him at the same time. Then when his mother and father came home from work, much intense discussion followed by more scolding, but a lot of fussing over him too. But Colin Powell said that his keenest memory of that day was not of the shock and the pain, but of feeling important, being the center of attention, knowing how much they loved and cared for him. That was his memory. Doesn't it all come down to this?